Today makes it 12 years since the demise of Mr. Dennis. Margaret had been living alone for many years after her husband passed away. The loneliness had started to weigh heavily on her, and she often found herself longing for company. One day she decided to visit her only son Williams, hoping to find some comfort in being around her family. When she arrived at Williams's house, she told him how difficult it had become to live alone. "I've been by myself for so long," she said, "since your father died. The house feels empty and I just need someone to be with. I miss having a little one around." Williams listened to his mother with concern. He understood that she was lonely and wanted to help her. After talking it over with his wife, they agreed that Bright, their 5-year-old son, could stay with his grandmother for a while. They thought it would be good for both Bright and Margaret. Bright would get to know his grandmother better, and Margaret would have the companionship she longed for. So Bright packed a small bag and left with his grandmother. He was excited about the idea of spending time at her house where everything was new and different. Margaret welcomed him warmly, making sure he felt at home. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Margaret doted on Bright, cooking his favorite meals, reading him stories, and tucking him in at night. Bright, in turn, enjoyed the attention and the change of scenery. But as the days passed, Margaret's loneliness began to creep back, and she found herself feeling empty. Even with Bright in the house, the joy she had felt at having him there started to fade, replaced by a strange longing she couldn't quite explain. Whenever Bright took his bath, Margaret would sometimes linger nearby. She would glance at him through the slightly open door, watching him with eyes that were filled with more than just the affection of a grandmother. At first, she tried to convince herself that she was just keeping an eye on him to make sure he was safe, but deep down she knew there was something wrong with the way she was feeling each time she saw him. Margaret's thoughts grew darker, her loneliness twisting into something more sinister. The once innocent joy she had found in Bright's presence became tainted as she began to see him not just as her grandson but as a means to fill the void in her heart. This unsettling feeling grew stronger with each passing day. The more Margaret watched Bright, the more she struggled with her emotions. As the days went by, Bright started to notice something odd about his grandmother. One afternoon, while he was taking bath, he glanced up and saw Margaret standing in the doorway watching him with an expression he couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just a quick look to make sure he was okay. She was staring at him in a way that made him feel uncomfortable, though he didn't know why. After he finished his bath, Bright decided to ask her about it. He was a curious boy and didn't like feeling confused, so in his simple, innocent way, he asked his grandmother why she was always looking at him so strangely. Margaret paused for a moment as if searching for the right words. Then she told him that she loved him very much, more than he could imagine. She said that she wanted him to stay with her forever, that his presence made her happier than she had been in years. Hearing this, Bright felt a warmth in his heart. He loved his grandmother too, and the idea of making her happy made him smile. He told her that he loved her and that he liked being with her. Meanwhile, back at William's house, things were not as peaceful. William's wife Sarah had never been entirely comfortable with the idea of Bright staying with Margaret. She had always felt a certain unease around her mother-in-law, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. As the days went on, Sarah grew more and more anxious. She missed her son terribly and began to regret agreeing to let him stay with Margaret. One morning, Sarah decided that enough was enough. She told Williams that she was going to get Bright and bring him back home. Williams tried to reassure her that everything was fine, that Bright was just having a good time with his grandmother, but Sarah's mind was made up. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When Sarah arrived at Margaret's house, she was relieved to see Bright playing outside with a few children from the neighborhood. He looked happy and healthy, laughing and running around. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of guilt for doubting Margaret's ability to care for their son. She walked over to Bright, expecting him to be excited to see her and ready to go home, but when she told Bright that it was time to leave, he surprised her by refusing. He told her that he had made new friends here, that he was having fun, and that his grandmother was taking very good care of him. Sarah was surprised. She hadn't expected this response. Bright had always been a bit of a mama's boy, always eager to be with her, and now here he was choosing to stay with his grandmother instead of coming home with her. Sarah tried to convince Bright, telling him that his father and she missed him and they wanted him back home, but Bright was firm in his decision. He said that he liked it at his grandmother's house, that he felt happy there, and that he didn't want to leave just yet. This left Sarah in a difficult position. She didn't want to force Bright to come home if he was genuinely happy. Margaret's attachment to Bright grew stronger. As the days passed, she began asking him to be in her room while she dressed. She told him it was to help her pick out clothes or to hand her items, and Bright, trusting his grandmother, didn't question it. He would sit quietly, sometimes turning his face away when she changed, believing this was a normal request. However, Margaret's behavior gradually became more concerning. She started touching Bright in ways that made him uncomfortable. At first, these touches were fleeting and confusing to him. He didn't understand why it felt so strange, but accepted it because it came from his grandmother, whom he trusted. Margaret reassured him that she loved him very much, and that this was just a way of showing her affection. Over time, Bright began to adapt to these new interactions. Although he felt uneasy, the attention and the sense of being loved made him more accepting. He was young and didn't fully grasp the nature of what was happening, believing it was just how his grandmother expressed her love. Bright didn't talk about these experiences with anyone, his friends or his parents, because Margaret had told him it was their special secret. He believed this and kept the details to himself, adjusting to this part of his life as something normal. As Bright grew older, the discomfort he felt around his grandmother Margaret only deepened. By the time he was 15 years old, he had become tired of the strange and uncomfortable things she made him do. He felt trapped in a situation he didn't fully understand but knew was wrong. One day, he couldn't take it anymore. He decided to leave Margaret's house and went to stay with a friend for a while, hoping to find some peace away from her. When Bright arrived at his friend's house, his friend noticed that something was off. Bright seemed distant, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. Concerned, his friend asked him what was going on, but Bright refused to talk about it. He kept everything bottled up inside, too embarrassed and confused to share the truth. He didn't want to burden his friend with the painful reality of what was happening at home while he stayed at his friend's house. Bright's mother called him. She had heard that he had left Margaret's house and was worried. She asked him why he had left so suddenly, and Bright struggled to find the right words. He didn't want to tell her the real reason, so he simply said that he wanted to spend some time with his friend. His mother, sensing that something wasn't quite right, told him that he should come home, that she missed him and wanted him back, but Bright couldn't bring himself to return. He told his mother that he was okay, that he just needed some time away. He didn't explain further, and his mother, though still concerned, didn't push him. She trusted that he would come back when he was ready. After a few days, Bridget reached out to Bright. She sounded different, softer and full of regret. She told Bright that she was sorry for everything that had happened, that she realized she had made mistakes. She promised him that she had changed, that she would be better, and that things would be different if he came back. She assured him that she loved him and just wanted them to be a family again. Bright, still young and wanting to believe in his grandmother's love, was swayed by her words. He wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe things could get better after all. Margaret was his beloved grandma, so despite the doubts that lingered in his mind, Bright decided to return to Margaret's house. When he walked through the door, Margaret greeted him with open arms. She seemed genuinely happy to have him back, and for a while things did seem different. She treated him with kindness and didn't push the boundaries that had made him so uncomfortable before. Bright began to relax, thinking that maybe things would be okay after all. A few weeks later, Bright's life took another tragic turn. His parents were involved in a serious car accident, and both were killed. The sudden loss devastated Bright, leaving him heartbroken and alone. Though Bright was now under Margaret's care again, their relationship had soured. The years of Margaret's troubling behavior had left him feeling unsettled and wary. Nonetheless, Margaret assured Bright that she would take good care of him, promising to manage his parents' property and wealth responsibly. As Bright grew older, he increasingly resented Margaret's ways. Her manipulative and inappropriate behavior had left him feeling trapped and unhappy. Despite this, he tried to focus on building his own life. When Bright turned 18, he met a girl named Precious at school. They fell in love, and their relationship quickly became serious. Excited about his future with Precious, Bright decided it was time for her to meet Margaret. He hoped that introducing Precious to his grandmother would improve the situation and bring some positive change into his life. However, when Precious arrived at Margaret's home, Margaret's reaction was far from welcoming. Margaret looked at Precious with a critical eye and expressed her disapproval openly. She accused Precious of being a gold digger and implied that she was only interested in Bright because of the wealth his parents had left behind. Bright was shocked by Margaret's harsh words. He defended Precious, insisting that she loved him for who he was, not for his family's money. The tension between Margaret and Precious was palpable. Precious left the house feeling hurt and uncomfortable, and Bright was troubled by the rift that had formed. Despite his grandmother's disapproval, Bright remained committed to his relationship with Precious. He couldn't understand why Margaret would be so negative and critical, and it only fueled his determination to protect his relationship. As time went on, Bright continued to face the challenges of living with Margaret while trying to build a future with Precious. The friction between his grandmother and his girlfriend created an emotional strain as Bright continued living with his grandmother Margaret. Tension in the house grew unbearable. Every time Marcus mentioned Emily or spent time with her, Bridget would lash out, accusing Precious of being a gold digger and treating Bright with cruelty. Bright had grown tired of her constant abuse, not just towards him but now towards the girl he loved. One day, after yet another argument with Margaret over Precious, Bright snapped. His frustration and anger boiled over, and he couldn't hold back his feelings any longer. He stood in front of his grandmother, his hands trembling with rage, and shouted at her. He called her a useless mother, someone who was so shameless for what she had done to him all these years. He told her that he was done with her games, done with the nonsense she had forced him to be part of. For a moment there was silence. Margaret's eyes flashed with a mix of shock and fury. She had never seen Bright stand up to her like this, but instead of backing down, she responded with cold, calculated words. Margaret told Bright that if he continued to disrespect her, she would tell everyone what had been going on between them. She said she wasn't ashamed of it, and that she would ruin his life if he tried to defy her. She warned him to stay away from Precious, threatening that if he didn't, she would expose their dark secret to the world. Bright felt a wave of fear wash over him. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of Margaret's threat. He had spent years trying to keep what had happened between them hidden, and the thought of it becoming public terrified him. He didn't know how he could face the world, his friends or Precious, if they found out the truth. The fear of shame and the possible consequences paralyzed him. Feeling trapped and desperate, Bright did the only thing he could think of to protect himself. He broke up with Precious. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. When he told her, Emily was confused and heartbroken, not understanding why Marcus was suddenly pushing her away. She tried to reach out to him, asking what had happened and why he was doing this, but Bright couldn't give her any answers. He simply said that it was over, that they couldn't be together anymore. After the breakup, Bright felt a deep emptiness inside him. He had lost the one person who made him feel truly happy and loved. Precious had been a light in his life, someone who had shown him what it meant to be cared for without conditions. Now that light was gone, extinguished by the darkness of his past and the control his grandmother still held over him. For years, Bright had lived under the suffocating control of his grandmother Margaret. The years of manipulation had worn him down. Every time he tried to pull away or refused her, she would remind him of her threats. Margaret would tell Bright to sleep with her, and if he hesitated, she would immediately resort to blackmail, warning him that she would tell the world about their dark secret. Worse, she said she would lie and twist the story, painting herself as the victim and Bright as the aggressor. She reminded him that people would believe her because she was his grandmother and he was a young man. No one would take his side. Each time Bright wanted to fight back, fear stopped him. The shame, the possibility of being humiliated, the fear of losing everything, these thoughts always made him comply. Margaret's threats haunted him day and night, and no matter how much he tried to break free, he felt trapped. This torment carried on for years, weighing him down as he struggled to navigate his life. Despite all this, Bright managed to move forward in other areas. He graduated from school and began working at his father's company. He was now living in his father's house, which gave him some distance from Margaret. His life should have been improving, but the weight of his past still clung to him. Though he was successful in his career, he still carried the deep scars from the years of manipulation and abuse. Amid all the darkness in his life, Bright met Deborah. She was everything he thought he wanted: beautiful, confident, and full of life. Deborah was the kind of woman who knew how to get what she wanted, and she loved to live lavishly. Her love for expensive things and her carefree spending habits were a reflection of her spoiled upbringing. She was used to having everything at her fingertips, whether it was designer clothes or luxury vacations. At first Bright didn't care about Deborah's spending habits. He was so taken by her beauty and charm that he overlooked the things that might have worried someone else. For Marcus, Sandra represented something new, something different from the heaviness he had lived with for so long. She was a breath of fresh air, someone who made him feel alive again. After months of dating, he found himself falling deeply in love with her, and soon he proposed. Deborah said yes, and for the first time in a long while Bright felt like he had a future to look forward to. But as always, there was Margaret. Even though Bright was living in his own house, Margaret still loomed over his life like a shadow. He knew that eventually he would have to introduce Deborah to her. The day came, and Bright brought Deborah over to meet his grandmother, hoping that perhaps this time Margaret would let him be happy. However, as soon as they left, Margaret made her opinion clear. She didn't like Deborah. She's spoiled, Margaret said bluntly. She's only with you for your money. You're blind if you think she actually loves you. All she sees is what your parents left behind. Her words stung because they echoed some of the doubts Bright had tried to push away. Despite Bridget's harsh words, Bright tried to ignore her. He wanted to believe that Deborah truly loved him and that she wasn't just after his wealth. But as time went on, he couldn't fully shake off the seed of doubt Margaret had planted. Deborah's extravagant lifestyle, her love for material things, and her careless spending all began to weigh on Bright. He started to wonder if maybe Margaret was right. Maybe Deborah didn't love him for who he was, but for what he could provide. Deborah had recently moved in with Bright as they were planning their wedding, a time that was supposed to be filled with excitement and hope for their future. Despite the doubts Bright sometimes had about Deborah's spending habits, he was determined to build a life with her. He believed that marriage would give him a fresh start, a chance to leave the dark memories of his past with Margaret behind. But Margaret wasn't ready to let Bright go. One afternoon when Deborah was out, Margaret came by unannounced. Bright felt uneasy the moment he saw her walk into the house. He had been trying to keep his distance from her ever since he started his new life with Deborah, but Margaret had a way of showing up when she wasn't wanted. Margaret's eyes scanned the room before she turned to Bright with a familiar look, the one he had grown to dread. Without hesitation, she told Bright to come with her to the bedroom. She demanded that he sleep with her, saying that it would be the last time. You're getting married soon, she reminded him. After this things will be different, but this will be the last time. Bright was horrified. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, Margaret would finally leave him alone now that he was getting married. He refused, his voice shaking with anger and disgust. He was determined to stand his ground this time, to not give in to her manipulation. But Margaret, as always, had a way of getting what she wanted. When Bright refused, she quickly turned to threats, just as she had done for years. She told him that if he didn't do as she asked, she would tell Deborah everything. Worse, she would twist the truth and tell everyone that Bright had been the one to pursue her. No one will believe you, Bright, she whispered. They'll believe me. Just like always, I'll ruin you and Deborah will leave you. Bright fell trapped. His heart pounded in his chest as the familiar wave of fear and shame washed over him. He had fought so hard to escape Margaret's control, to start a new life with Deborah, but now it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't risk losing Deborah or having his life destroyed against his will. He gave into Margaret's demands, once again hating himself for being so powerless. As they were in the bedroom, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. It was Deborah, back earlier than expected. She had returned home unannounced, eager to share some exciting news about their wedding plans. But as she walked into the house, she noticed something strange. The house was too quiet, and Bright wasn't anywhere to be seen. Curious and slightly concerned, Deborah made her way to the bedroom. She pushed open the door, and what she saw on the other side stopped her in her tracks. There in front of her was Bright with his grandmother in a situation she could hardly believe. Deborah's heart sank, and shock quickly turned to anger and betrayal. She didn't know what to think, but all she could see was her fiancé, the man she was about to marry, in a moment of intimacy with his grandmother. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Bright immediately jumped up, panic flooding his face. He rushed over to Deborah, trying to explain. It's not what you think, he pleaded. I didn't want this. Please, Deborah, you have to believe me. But Deborah Couldn't hear his words, her mind was spinning, and she felt sick to her stomach. How could this be happening? How could Bright, the man she loved, be involved in something so twisted and wrong? She backed away from him, tears welling up in her eyes. Margaret, on the other hand, stood in the background watching the scene unfold with a small, satisfied smile on her face. This was exactly what she had wanted all along. For years she had controlled Bright, but now with Deborah walking in on them, she saw an opportunity to destroy Bright's relationship entirely. In her twisted mind, Margaret didn't want Bright to be free or happy. She wanted to keep him under her control forever, and if that meant ruining his engagement, she was more than willing to do it. Deborah couldn't stay in the house any longer. She turned and ran out, ignoring Bright's desperate calls for her to come back. She didn't want to hear his explanations. In her mind, nothing could justify what she had just seen. Bright was devastated. He knew that everything was falling apart. He had always feared that Margaret would destroy his life, and now it seemed like she had finally succeeded. He had tried so hard to escape her control, but once again she had dragged him back into the darkness. For days, Bright tried to reach out to Deborah, but she refused to speak to him. Margaret, meanwhile, acted as though nothing had happened, her cold demeanor showing no sign of remorse. She had succeeded in driving a wedge between Bright and the one person who had given him hope for a different life. Marcus sat in his house, his mind heavy with guilt and shame. He had been living a life for so long, trapped by the manipulation of both his grandmother Margaret and now Deborah. The memory of what Deborah had witnessed that terrible day haunted him, and he could feel the walls closing in on his life. He loved Deborah once, but now she had become another person trying to control him. One evening Deborah came to the house, her face cold and distant. Without hesitation she told Bright that their relationship was over. Her voice was steady, her mind clearly made up, but before she left she dropped a bombshell. "You're going to keep giving me large amounts of money every month," she demanded, "or I'll tell everyone what I saw that day." Bright was stunned. He had expected her to leave him after what happened, but to use his shame against him like this was something he hadn't imagined. He fell to his knees, begging her to reconsider. He pleaded for her understanding, trying to explain that he never wanted any of this to happen, but Deborah didn't care. Her decision was final, and she knew how to use his fear against him. From that day on, Bright lived in constant fear. Every month Deborah would call him, demanding more money if he hesitated or gave her less than she wanted. She would remind him of her threat. The weight of the secret continued to eat away at him, and Bright felt like he was drowning in guilt and shame. One Sunday Bright decided he had had enough. He went to church, seeking some kind of relief from the torment in his heart. As he sat quietly in the back, he prayed like he had never prayed before. He asked God for forgiveness, for strength, and for a way out of the nightmare his life had become. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt a small glimmer of hope as he walked out of the church that day. As he left, a woman caught his eye. She was standing outside, smiling warmly at him. Her name was Joy, and she introduced herself with a friendly tone that immediately put Bright at ease. They got to talking, and Bright found himself drawn to her. Joy was very peaceful, something pure and kind that Bright hadn't experienced in a long time. They quickly became friends, and Blessing would sometimes come over to Bright's house. She seemed to understand him without him needing to say much, but Bright knew that he couldn't keep hiding the truth from her. One day, after weeks of getting to know each other, Bright decided it was time to tell Joy everything. He sat her down and confessed the painful story that had haunted him for years. He told her how it all started when he was just a little boy, how Margaret, his own grandmother, had manipulated him, used him, and controlled his life for so many years. He explained the shame he carried, the fear that if anyone knew the truth, his life would be over. Joy listened quietly, never interrupting, her eyes full of understanding and compassion. When Bright was finished, Joy spoke softly but firmly. She told him that the only way he could truly be free was to confess, not just to her but to God and to the world. She assured him that God would forgive him, but he had to let go of the fear and shame that had been holding him captive. She urged him to confess in the church, to lay his burden down once and for all. It took Bright some time to gather the courage, but the following Sunday, he stood up in church, his heart pounding in his chest. With Joy by his side, he walked to the front and faced the congregation. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice shaky at first but gaining strength as he went on. He told the entire church about the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his grandmother, how it had started when he was just a child and how it had destroyed his life. In so many ways. To Bright's surprise, when he finished speaking, there was no judgment, no scorn, instead the entire congregation began to applaud. People stood up and clapped, not because of what he had gone through, but because he had found the strength to come forward and tell the truth. They applauded his bravery, his willingness to confront his past, and his desire to heal. The news of Bright's confession spread quickly. It went viral on social media, and soon people everywhere were talking about it. Many condemned Margaret for what she had done to her grandson, calling her actions wicked and unforgivable. The story brought attention to the issue of abuse, and people who had suffered in silence began to speak out, inspired by Bright's courage. Bright, for the first time in years, felt a sense of freedom. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long was lifted. He knew he still had a long way to go in his healing, but now he wasn't alone. He had joy by his side, the support of his church, and the knowledge that he had finally taken control of his own life. The fear that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of hope. As for Margaret, the public outrage against her grew. She was shunned by the community, and people turned their backs on her. The truth had finally come to light, and Bright was no longer her victim. One day Margaret decided to go to the roadside fruit seller, hoping to escape the suffocating loneliness that had surrounded her ever since the truth about her actions came out. She had become an outcast in the community. People whispered whenever she walked by, pointing fingers, condemning her for what she had done to Bright. The weight of guilt and shame was heavy, but Margaret was too proud to admit it, too stubborn to apologize or ask for forgiveness. As she approached the fruit stand, she noticed a group of boys playing nearby. At first she ignored them, but soon she saw them start to whisper among themselves. Their whispers turned to laughter, and then one of them pointed directly at her. Panic began to rise in her chest, a feeling she had been experiencing more and more lately. Whenever she went out, it seemed that no matter where she went, people either stared at her in disgust or talked behind her back. Suddenly the boys started running toward her, shouting and laughing as if mocking her. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen this before, people harassing her, making her feel like she didn't belong. She was consumed with fear. She didn't want to face them. The shame of what she had done to her grandson, now known to everyone, weighed heavily on her. She turned and began to run, desperate to escape their laughter, desperate to run from her own guilt. In her panic, she didn't notice that she was running toward a busy road. Her vision blurred, and the only thing on her mind was getting away from the boys, from the shame, from everything. As she reached the edge of the road, a loud honk pierced the air. She barely had time to turn her head before a speeding car came barreling toward her. The driver couldn't stop in time. In an instant, Margaret was struck, her body thrown into the air, and she landed with a thud on the pavement. She died instantly. The boys who had been running toward her stopped in their tracks, horrified at what they had just witnessed. People gathered around, but no one seemed surprised. It was as though the whole community had seen her tragic end coming. Margaret had lived a life of manipulation and cruelty, and now, in a moment of panic and fear, her life had come to a sudden, violent end. Meanwhile, Bright was finally free from the weight of his past. A few months after Margaret's death, he married Joy. The ceremony was simple, but filled with love and joy. Blessing had been a source of light in Bright's darkest times, and now she was his partner, the person who helped him see a future beyond the pain he had endured for so long. Standing at the altar, Bright felt a sense of peace he had never known. He was no longer the broken boy who had been trapped in his grandmother's wicked web. He was a man ready to start a new chapter with someone who truly loved and cared for him. As for Deborah, she had tried to cling to Bright, hoping she could still manipulate him as she had done before, but Bright was no longer the man she could control. When she realized that Bright had told the world his story and had nothing more to hide, her grip on him slipped away. Deborah had no choice but to stop her blackmailing. Knowing that Bright no longer feared her threats, she attempted to reach out to Bright, trying to apologize, even hinting that they could start over, but it was far too late. Bright had moved on, both emotionally and physically. Deborah had become a distant memory, a reminder of a time when Bright had been too scared to stand up for himself. Now, with Joy by his side, Bright was stronger, more confident, and ready to live the life he deserved. He worked hard at his father's company, and every day he thanked God for the new life he had been given. He had learned that healing was possible even after years of pain, and that love could truly save him from the darkest of places. Bright often reflected on how far he had come. The journey had been difficult, filled with heartbreak, shame, and fear, but through it all he had found strength in his faith in joy and in himself. The past no longer held power over him. He had let go of the guilt and found forgiveness, not just from God but from himself. Dear viewers, what lessons did you learn from this dramatic story? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to this channel for more amazing and must-watch videos of this kind. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay blessed. Thank you.